So I want you to imagine an engineering firm, and they decide to build this massive, gleaming skyscraper.
Okay, a skyscraper, I can picture that.
Right. But instead of using, steel beams and reinforced concrete for the actual foundation, they just use painted cardboard.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. But the thing is, it looks absolutely magnificent from the outside. I mean, the facade is flawless, the design is modern, and most importantly, they stamp the name of the wealthiest, most prestigious engineering firm in the world right there on the lobby wall.
Right, so the branding is impeccable.
Yeah, the branding is perfect.
Hmm.
And because of that name, people don't just admire the building, they actually move in. Like, city planners start using it as a model for future construction.
Because nobody actually bothers to check the basement?
Nobody checks the basement. They don't look at the cardboard beams because, well, the experts built it, and the billionaires funded it.
Right, they just assume the structural integrity is totally sound.
Exactly. Right up until the moment the walls literally start caving in. So what if that cardboard wasn't a building, but a scientific consensus?
That is such a chilling analogy, and it fits perfectly.
Yeah, because today we are unpacking what is arguably one of the most catastrophic institutional failures in modern history. We're doing a deep dive into the American eugenics movement.
And, it really is the ultimate illusion of authority. Like, as historians of science, when we look back at the archives of this era, the truly terrifying part isn't actually the bad science itself.
Because bad science is always around.
Right, exactly. Bad science has always existed.
Yeah.
The terrifying part is the letterheads on the documents.
Logos on the building.
Yes. We are looking at how this completely fringe theory was basically draped in the visual language of absolute competence, and how it got elevated into literal state and federal policy just because it had the right address.
And the backing of all the right institutions.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the mission of our deep dive today, for you listening, is to explore a really dark question.
A very dark question.
How did the idea of, quote, improving the human race through controlled breeding become mainstream, highly prestigious science?
And to do that, we're pulling from historical dossiers, the archives from Cold Spring Harbor, and the Embryo Project Encyclopedia.
Right. And for you, as an undergraduate student of the history of science, we really want you to look through the eyes of historians today who investigate these massive failures.
Because we have to start by dispelling a really comforting myth, which is that science exists in a vacuum.
Right, the idea of pure, objective science.
Exactly. To set the stakes here, we have to recognize that science is just a method. It's not a priesthood. It carries the values and the prejudices and, honestly, the profound economic anxieties of whoever is paying for it.
Who is funding the lab, basically.
Right. When we examine the eugenics movement, we are not looking at anti-science quackery operating in the shadows. We are looking at mainstream science wearing a white coat backed by elite universities.
Which just makes it so much more dangerous than, a lone fraudster selling snake oil out of a wagon.
No, absolutely. The institutions act as a shield.
So let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century, like year 1910. Before this, you basically just had the theoretical idea of eugenics, right?
Right, which traces back to 1883. That's when Francis Galton coined the term.
And he was Charles Darwin's cousin, wasn't he?
He was. And he essentially looked at his cousin's theories of natural selection and just entirely misinterpreted them to fit human social hierarchies. The word comes from the Greek for well-born.
But for a couple of decades, it was just sort of this idea floating around academic faculty lounges. It wasn't in operation yet.
No, it was mostly talk. But then in 1910, the idea gets an address. It actually gets an office.
It gets an industrial engine.
Yeah.
And they built that engine on Long Island, New York.
Yeah.
In this little farmhouse at Cold Spring Harbor.
Right. A Harvard-trained biologist named Charles Davenport opens the Eugenics Record Office, or the ERO.
The ERO. And he brings in this guy, Harry H. Laughlin, to help him run it. Now, Laughlin was previously a school superintendent from Iowa, right?
Yeah, a former school teacher who ends up running this massive data operation. But it's really crucial to understand Davenport here.
Because he wasn't just some fringe weirdo howling at the moon.
Exactly. Davenport was a highly credentialed, totally legitimate biologist. He had studied the recently rediscovered genetic laws of Gregor Mendel.
The pea plant guy.
The pea plant guy, right. But Davenport takes Mendel's work and just makes this colossal, totally unscientific leap.
This is where the cardboard foundation really gets poured, isn't it?
It really is. So Davenport takes Mendel's discrete laws of inheritance, which, worked perfectly well for predicting the physical traits of pea plants, and recklessly maps them onto vastly complex human socioeconomic conditions.
Right, because Mendel found that simple traits, like whether a pea is yellow or green or wrinkled or smooth, are inherited as these discrete units.
Which we now call genes. It's an elegant, predictable system for simple biology.
But Davenport looked at that and was like, oh, complex human social behaviors must work the exact same binary way.
Yes, he genuinely believed that things like pauperism, literally just the state of being poor or criminality, were single inheritable Mendelian units.
Wait, so if your parents were poor, he thought you inherited the, poverty gene.
Exactly, just like a pea inherits a wrinkled pod, and the catch-all term they loved to use was feeble-mindedness.
Right, which meant almost anything. But I have to bring up the one that just blew my mind when I read the dossiers. Thalassophilia.
Ah, yes, thalassophila.
I literally had to reread the page 3 times. Thalassophilia, the supposed hereditary love of the sea.
Yeah, Davenport defined it as a sex-linked recessive genetic trait, and he claimed it was found almost exclusively in male naval officers.
Are you seriously telling me that a Harvard-trained biologist published actual papers arguing that wanting to be on a boat was a Mendelian trait?
I am. It is staggeringly ridiculous to us now.
Like, if I enjoy sailing, it's because of a recessive gene. And only if I'm a man.
Apparently so. And frankly, rigorous biologists at the time should have recognized it as absurd immediately.
Because jumping from the color of a pea pod to wanting to join the Navy is just, it's a massive chasm.
A massive, undeniable chasm. It completely ignores, environmental factors, economic realities, geography.
Family tradition, like if your dad's in the Navy, maybe you just grew up around boats.
Exactly. Or pure chance. But Davenport just swept all of that off the table. He reduced the entirety of the messy, complicated human experience to a simple, fatalistic biological equation.
And to prove this ridiculous equation, Davenport and Laughlin didn't just sit in a lab with microscopes. They turned this farmhouse into a massive data-gathering machine.
They literally sent people out into the world to hunt for these genes. The ERO trained this whole army of field workers.
And sociologically, this part is just fascinating to me. These field workers were almost exclusively young, unmarried women, right?
Yes, mostly young women who had some rudimentary background in college biology.
And the ERO arms them with these standardized forms, clipboards, and this manual they called the Trait Book,
which gave them very basic, highly flawed training in how to spot, quote, defective traits. And then they dispatched them across the country.
They essentially fanned out like a census bureau for biological determinism.
That's a great way to put it.
But where did they go? Because they certainly didn't go to wealthy country clubs in Newport to measure the traits of the rich.
No, of course not. They went to mental institutions, state prisons, orphanages, and poorhouses.
Right. They were tasked with building these things called family pedigrees.
They were trying to trace the bloodlines of the people locked inside these institutions. The goal was to prove that their defects, whether that was epilepsy or poverty or sex work, were entirely genetic and generational.
But wait, just as a student of history looking at this, think about the methodology here. They are treating complex human poverty exactly like Mendel treated his garden.
They are.
So they look at a woman in a poorhouse and say, her mother was also in a poorhouse, therefore the trait for poverty is dominant.
Yes, that was literally the logic.
But that completely ignores the incredibly obvious reality that if you are born into crushing, inescapable poverty, you are just highly likely to remain in poverty.
Exactly.
How could trained biologists miss the environment entirely?
Well, because they were explicitly trained to miss it. They were actively conflating inheritance with environment, which is the foundational sin of this whole movement.
They couldn't see the environment because their theory didn't allow for it.
Right. To these field workers who were heavily indoctrinated by Davenport's rigid ideology, every single social outcome was just a genetic symptom.
And we really need to highlight the power dynamic of this data collection. Because for anyone studying institutional history, you have to picture this scene.
It's a very stark image. You have a college-educated, middle-class young woman, dressed well, backed by the implicit authority of a major scientific institution.
And she walks into a state-run asylum or a rural poorhouse.
Right. And she sits down across from an impoverished, highly marginalized, often institutionalized person.
Someone who has absolutely zero ability or agency to refuse institutional power. Like, they can't say no.
Precisely. The subjects of these pedigree studies were inmates or wards of the state. They could not refuse to answer deeply intimate questions.
Questions about their parents, their grandparents, their sexual histories.
Or the mental states of their siblings. And the field workers would extract this coerced testimony, combine it with, like, whatever neighborhood gossip they could pick up from the local townspeople.
Wait, they use town gossip as scientific data?
Oh, heavily. They'd make these snap judgments about the physical appearance and presumed intelligence of the subjects based on rumors, and then distill all that messy, biased human suffering into a neat little index card.
And then those index cards went straight back to the farmhouse in Cold Spring Harbor, where Harry Laughlin just filed them away.
Over the years, they amassed hundreds of thousands of these case files.
They built this gigantic pseudoscientific card catalog of the entire American population. Filing cabinets, standardized forms, published bulletins.
And those highly structured pedigree charts, with the little squares for men and circles for women.
Right. Visually, it looked incredibly official. It had all the aesthetics of rigorous science.
It looked exactly like hard data. But the raw data itself was fundamentally corrupted by the biases of the observers.
And the absolute vulnerability of the observed. Which brings up a really glaring question for me.
Let's hear it.
If the data is this flimsy-like, if they are literally asking a woman in an asylum for gossip about her uncle and then classifying him as genetically criminal based on hearsay, how on earth did they convince the country this was legitimate?
How do you sell cardboard as steel on a national level?
Exactly. I mean, how did a small farmhouse operation pull this off?
Well, you don't sell the cardboard. You sell the logo on the building.
Oh, right. The prestige.
Exactly. It wasn't the data that convinced the public or the politicians. It was the checkbook.
And this is where the story shifts, right? From a flawed biological theory into this blistering indictment of elite institutions.
Because Charles Davenport's operation wasn't funded by local big sales or even modest academic grants.
No, the ERO was bankrolled by America's great industrial fortunes, the absolute titans of the Gilded Age.
When you look at the funding sources, the founding patron was Mary Harriman. She was the enormously wealthy widow of the railroad baron E.H. Harriman.
Right, she actually bought the land for them, didn't she?
She bought the land, she paid the salaries of the field workers. She basically built the engine. And then, in 1918, she transferred the ERO and its massive endowment over to the Carnegie Institution of Washington.
An institution built, obviously, on Andrew Carnegie's steel money.
Right. And we also see substantial additional backing from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Okay, so let's unpack this for the listener. Why does the money matter so much to the validation of the science? I mean, if the science is bad, shouldn't the scientific community just reject it?
In a perfect idealized world, yes, they would.
Regardless of who buys the microscope.
Exactly. But in the actual ecosystem of American authority, institutional power structures maintain their authority through association and prestige.
It's all about the letterhead.
Exactly. When the Carnegie Institution of Washington puts its letterhead on a research bulletin, it ceases to be a hypothesis. It instantly becomes an edict.
So if you are a state legislator in the 1920s and somebody hands you a massive, bound study on the heredity of crime.
You probably don't know the first thing about Mendelian genetic ratios.
Right. You're a politician, not a biologist. But you look at the top of the paper and you see the Carnegie logo.
You see Rockefeller's name.
And you immediately read it as settled science. You just think, well, the richest, most successful philanthropists in the country are putting their names on this.
They hire the best minds. This must be the absolute cutting edge of human knowledge.
Wow. So the authority came entirely from the names on the checks.
It really did. And it wasn't just the money itself. It was the social and academic network that the money bought and influenced.
The dossiers call this the respectable network.
Yes. We have to completely dispel this cinematic idea that eugenics was like a dark, hidden conspiracy of mad scientists operating an underground lair.
It was entirely mainstream.
It was a movement that was embraced, enthusiastically endorsed, and aggressively propagated by this respectable network.
And the list of names in this network is just staggering. I mean, it reads like a who's who of American intellectual royalty.
We are talking about university presidents, celebrated thought leaders, the people who were literally writing the textbooks.
Let's list some of them because it's shocking. David Starr Jordan, the founding president of Stanford University. He chaired the very first U.S. Eugenics Committee.
Right. And Charles Eliot, the highly revered president of Harvard, he served as the vice president of the International Eugenics Congress.
Wait, the president of Harvard?
Yes. And Woodrow Wilson, who is president of Princeton before becoming the president of the United States, he was a massive supporter.
He actually signed a compulsory sterilization law when he was governor of New Jersey, right?
Yeah. He did. What's fascinating here is how thoroughly the academic elite surrendered their critical faculties to a social prejudice, simply because it was disguised as biology.
Just because it wore a lab coat. The list just keeps going. Henry Fairfield Osborn, the prestigious president of the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
He was actively hosting eugenics conferences and promoting these ideas through museum exhibits.
And Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia University, a Nobel laureate, lending his immense prestige to the cause.
As a historian looking back at these archives, you really have to grasp the sheer magnitude of this institutional capture.
Every major pillar of American intellectual life, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, the Museum of Natural History, Carnegie, Rockefeller.
They all looked at this cardboard skyscraper and publicly declared, "This is the most structurally sound building we've ever seen. Move in."
It utterly shatters the myth of pure science, doesn't it?
It does. We like to comfort ourselves with this belief that the scientific method operates in the sterile, objective realm, completely immune to political and social biases.
But the respectable network proves that science is incredibly susceptible to the anxieties of the elite. Which begs the question, why? Why were all these university presidents and industrial titans so eager to fund a theory about human breeding?
Well, because they were living in an era of unprecedented social upheaval.
Right, the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Think about it. Rapid industrialization, massive waves of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, the explosive growth of urban slums.
Widespread labor strikes, visible urban poverty.
Exactly. The old Protestant Anglo-Saxon elites were terrified. They looked at this changing country and feared what they called degeneration.
And eugenics offered them a highly comforting biological justification for the existing social hierarchy.
That is the core of it. It allowed them to look at the massive inequality of the Gilded Age and say, oh, this isn't a failure of our ruthless economic system.
This is just the natural sorting of superior and inferior genes.
It was the ultimate scientific absolution. It totally washed their hands of any social responsibility.
Because if poverty is purely genetic, well, you don't need to build better schools. You don't need to pass labor laws.
And you certainly don't need to raise wages.
You just need to stop the poor from having children.
Right. And because these elites backed it, eugenics permeated every single layer of American culture. It wasn't just debated in Ivy League faculty lounges.
It was taught in high school biology textbooks as established fact. And they literally had displays at state fairs, didn't they?
Yes, the Fitter Families contest. This is truly one of the most surreal aspects of the entire era.
I want you to picture this scene. You are at an agricultural state fair in the Midwest, right? You got the prize-winning squash, the largest hog, the best cherry pie.
Standard state fair stuff.
Then right next to the livestock pavilion, there is a medical tent. Entire families would just submit to physical, psychiatric, and intelligence examinations.
And the judges, who were usually local doctors trained in these eugenic principles, would calculate their hereditary worth.
Like prize cattle.
Yeah.
And they would award medals to the families with the supposedly best genetic pedigrees.
Do you remember what the medals said?
I do. The medals literally read, "Yay, I have a goodly heritage."
It was the absolute normalization of human breeding, presented as this wholesome, patriotic, civic duty.
It equated the cultivation of human beings with the breeding of livestock.
It really did.
So we have all this elite funding, we have university presidents signing off, and literal medals being handed out at state fairs. But if we actually open up the case files that these institutions were paying for.
Right, if we look at the core evidence.
Yeah, if we look at what the field workers were mailing back to Long Island, what does that data actually look like under a microscope?
When we put the data under a microscope, the illusion shatters entirely. The evidence manufactured by the ERO and its associated researchers was unequivocally junk science.
It was basically a masterclass in confirmation bias.
And methodological fraud. Let's look at the fraud of the pedigrees, because there are two incredibly famous, vastly influential family studies produced during this era.
Right. These became like the holy texts of the eugenics movement, the Jukes and the Kallikaks.
Yes. These studies were essentially used as the ironclad proof that crime and poverty were strictly hereditary.
So let's start with the Jukes.
Yeah.
Because the way this study was manipulated is highly revealing for historians.
It is. The original study actually predates the ERO. It was published back in 1877 by a sociologist named Richard Dugdale.
Okay. And Dugdale studied a poor extended family in upstate New York.
Right.
He gave them the pseudonym Jukes.
Right. He painstakingly tracked them through local records and found high rates of crime, disease, and poverty within this family over several generations.
So wait, Dugdale didn't say it was in their genes, did he?
No,
Yeah.
he emphatically did not. Dugdale was writing before the rediscovery of Mendel. He explicitly emphasized the environment.
So his conclusion was environmental, not biological.
Completely. He argued that if a child is raised in a degraded, impoverished environment, entirely without access to education or adequate nutrition or economic opportunity,
They are highly likely to fall into the same traps as their parents, which makes total sense.
his book was actually a sociological argument intended to spur social reform and public investment.
But the eugenicists at the ERO couldn't use a study that blamed the environment.
No, that would defeat their entire biological premise. That would mean society had to actually spend money to fix slums.
So what did they do with Dugdale's work? Because they cited it constantly.
They co-opted it and fundamentally reversed its meaning. They purposefully stripped out all of Dugdale's environmental caveats.
Just deleted them.
Basically, they took his raw genealogical data, completely ignored his progressive conclusions, and reworked the entire study into a strict biological parable of hereditary degeneracy.
They pointed to the Jukes family tree and just said, look at these generations of criminals. It's in the blood.
Exactly. They weaponized a study that was originally meant to advocate for social welfare, turning it into a foundational argument for biological elimination.
Honestly, is intellectual theft.
It really is.
But that wasn't even the worst of it. Because the truly notorious study, the one that became a massive public sensation and a staple in college biology textbooks for decades, was the Kallikaks.
Yes. The Kallikak family, published in 1912 by an American psychologist named Henry Goddard.
Henry Goddard.
Why?
He is a pivotal figure here. He was the director of research at the Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Girls and Boys in New Jersey.
Right, and Goddard was actually the man who imported the first Binet intelligence tests from France into the United States. He's also the one who coined the clinical term moron.
Which is wild to think about now. So with the Kallikak family, Goddard thought he had found the perfect, undeniable natural experiment to prove that feeble-mindedness was a purely hereditary trait.
A Mendelian recessive trait specifically. And we should probably clarify for the listener, feeble-mindedness wasn't a strict medical diagnosis.
No, not at all. It was an incredibly vague catch-all term for anyone deemed intellectually, morally, or socially inadequate by the standards of, well, middle-class observers.
Exactly. It included everything from mild learning disabilities to promiscuity to simply being perceived as rebellious.
So Goddard traces the ancestry of a young girl in his institution. He gives the family the pseudonym Kallikak, which is this very heavy-handed combination of the Greek words for good, kalos, and bad, kakos.
Right, very subtle.
Yeah. So Goddard claims that this young girl's great-great-grandfather, a man he called Martin Kallikak, was a Revolutionary War soldier.
And the story Goddard weaves is that during the war, Martin had a brief, illicit dalliance with a feeble-minded tavern girl, and they produced an illegitimate son.
Okay, that's branch number one.
Right. Then after the war, Martin went home, straightened out his life, and married a respectable Quaker woman of good stock.
And that's branch number two. So Goddard presents these two diverging branches of descendants, both stemming from the exact same man.
He presents it as a perfectly controlled genetic experiment. The descendants of the respectable Quaker wife, the good branch, supposedly grew up to be doctors, lawyers, landowners, and upstanding citizens. But the descendants of the feeble-minded tavern girl, the bad branch, supposedly grew up to be criminals, paupers, alcoholics, and prostitutes.
And Goddard presented this massive family tree as ironclad, indisputable proof. One man, two women of different genetic quality, and a clear genetic divergence.
That was the pitch.
But let me just play devil's advocate here for a second as a historian. How do you accurately trace the cognitive and moral status of the descendants of an undocumented tavern girl from the 1770s?
Well, you don't. It is historically and scientifically impossible. The methodology Goddard used to gather this data is absolutely mind-boggling.
Because he sent his field workers out into the rural pine barrens of New Jersey
Right.
to track down the living descendants of the bad branch.
Right. And how did they diagnose these people as feeble-minded? They didn't administer standardized cognitive tests. They diagnosed them on site.
Wait, on site. You mean a field worker would literally just walk up to a shack in the woods, look at the person living there, talk to them for 5 minutes, and decide, yes, this person possesses the genetic trait for feeble-mindedness.
That is precisely what happened. It was purely anecdotal, heavily impressionistic, and totally saturated in class prejudice.
So if someone was poor and uneducated, the field worker just assumed they were genetically defective.
Exactly. They would note that a family lived in squalor, or that the children were dirty, or that the adults seemed slow to answer questions.
Questions posed by a wealthy stranger with a clipboard judging them.
Right. And for the historical figures, the ancestors who were long dead, they relied entirely on local gossip and rumor to retroactively diagnose them as feeble-minded.
So the entire mountain of data was nothing more than highly formalized, institutionally sanctioned gossip.
That's exactly what it was.
But here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, deeply sinister. Because it wasn't just the data collection that was fraudulent. It was the visual presentation of the data.
Yes, the visual manipulation.
Because the published book, The Kallikak Family, included photographs of the living descendants of the bad branch. And Goddard's team literally doctored the photos, didn't they?
They did. This is one of the most damning, undeniable aspects of this history. When historians eventually examined the original glass plate negatives and compared them to the published book, the fraud was obvious.
The photographs of the bad Kallikaks were deliberately retouched in the darkroom before publication.
Right.
Wait, they literally drew on the photos in 1912. How did they think they could get away with that? Didn't the academic community notice the ink?
You have to understand how photography was perceived in the early 20th century. The general public, and even the academic public, viewed photography as an infallible, mechanical reproduction of reality.
See, the camera doesn't lie.
Exactly. It was seen as objective truth. Furthermore, the halftone printing process used in books at the time was relatively crude, which actually helped obscure the physical alterations.
So what did they actually draw on the faces?
Goddard's team used ink to darken the eyes of the subjects, giving them a hollow, deeply sinister, almost demonic look. They accentuated lines on the faces to make them appear more haggard, twisted, and degenerate. They darkened the brows to make them look primitive.
They literally drew the conclusion they wanted the reader to reach directly onto the faces of their subjects.
They did.
Think about the brazen circular logic here. The whole premise of the book is that bad genes make you look a certain way and act a certain way.
Right.
So you go out into the woods and find poor people who act in ways you disapprove of. You take their picture, but they just look like normal, poor farmers.
They don't look sinister enough for the narrative.
So you literally paint dark circles around their eyes in the darkroom. And you publish the book, slap a university logo on it, and say, look, science proves that bad genes create monsters.
It is the absolute definition of cooking the data to fit the premise. And because the book's conclusions so perfectly confirmed the existing prejudices of the upper and middle classes,
It was a massive hit.
it was a runaway success. It scientifically assured the wealthy that their wealth was a natural sign of biological superiority, and it warned the middle class that the poor were a literal genetic threat. The Kallikaks was translated into multiple languages and cited for decades.
But surely, if the fraud was this obvious, if the methodology was literally, I looked at him and he seemed dumb, and the photos were clearly inked, why did the scientific community rebel?
Well, some scientists did notice.
Because we are talking about an era with brilliant geneticists. Where were the rigorous biologists calling us out?
It's a common misconception that absolutely everyone in the scientific community blindly believed this stuff. There were real scientists who looked at Harry Laughlin's math and Henry Goddard's methodologies and saw exactly what we see today: junk.
Okay, so there was pushback.
Yes. But their pushback reveals a crucial, enduring lesson about how scientific consensus actually functions and why it can sometimes become a trap.
Let's talk about that pushback. Because the flaws in the ERO's methods were not a closely guarded secret.
Not at all. There were geneticists who deeply understood the complexity of Mendel's laws and realized that Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin were just butchering them.
And one of the most prominent dissenting voices was a highly respected geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, right? Herbert Spencer Jennings.
Yes, Jennings is a fascinating counterweight in this history. He publicly condemned the work coming out of the ERO. Specifically, he took aim at Harry Laughlin's statistics regarding immigration, declaring them mathematically and logically invalid.
Let's look at Laughlin's statistics for a second, because this shows exactly how you can use math to lie.
And Laughlin loved his statistics.
He was obsessed with immigration. He was desperate to keep out people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Greeks, Eastern European Jews.
Right, and to do that, he produced these massive reports claiming that recent immigrants from these areas had far higher rates of institutionalization for things like insanity, crime, or dependency than older, established American families.
Now, let me play devil's advocate again. If Harry Laughlin is looking at raw census data and asylum records, and he is seeing higher institutionalization rates for certain immigrant groups, isn't he just reporting the math?
He is reporting numbers, yes.
So how did Jennings prove the math itself was fraudulent?
Because Laughlin was committing a massive statistical shell game, he was ignoring the most crucial variables.
He was dropping context.
Completely. Jennings pointed out the fatal flaw in Laughlin's comparison. Laughlin was comparing new immigrants, people who had just arrived off the boats, who often didn't speak English, who faced intense discrimination, and who were thrust into the most brutal, poverty-stricken urban slums in America.
He was comparing them against long-settled populations.
Yes. Populations whose ancestors had been in the country for generations, who had established wealth, land, and social safety nets.
So, if a recent immigrant has a mental breakdown due to the trauma of migration and the crushing poverty of a tenement, they end up in a state asylum because they have nowhere else to go.
Exactly. But if a wealthy descendant of the Mayflower has a mental breakdown, they are quietly cared for at a private estate. They don't show up in Laughlin's state asylum data.
Wow. The difference in their institutionalization rates was a product of environmental stress, economic class, and the lack of social assimilation.
It had nothing to do with genetics. But Laughlin looked at that discrepancy and falsely labeled the difference heredity.
He essentially testified that because Italians living in slums are in the poorhouse more often than wealthy Anglo-Saxons, Italians must be biologically, genetically inferior.
And Jennings called it out. He showed that Laughlin was confusing correlation with causation, ignoring the denominator of total population sizes, and completely erasing the environmental variable.
So we have a highly respected Johns Hopkins geneticist loudly pointing out that the math is fundamentally wrong.
Loud and clear.
If we connect this to the bigger picture for historians analyzing institutional momentum, why did Jennings fail to stop the runaway train? Why do experts fail to challenge a corrupt consensus?
Because of the mechanics of institutional failure. When an idea is backed by the president of Harvard, the president of Stanford, the Carnegie Institution, and the Rockefeller Foundation.
The respectable network.
Right. When all of them back it, dissenters like Herbert Spencer Jennings are just easily drowned out. The establishment had heavily publicly invested its prestige in eugenics.
To admit that Laughlin was a mathematical fraud and that Davenport was a sloppy theorist would have required these massive institutions to publicly admit they were funding junk science.
It's the cardboard skyscraper again. The building is deemed too big to fail.
If Harvard or Carnegie admits the lobby is made of cardboard, the entire institution loses face.
Exactly. So it's easier to just ignore the building inspector who is shouting about the foundation. The institutions close ranks.
They control the funding streams, they control the peer-reviewed academic journals, they control the university presses.
And this is the central, enduring lesson for historians. Bad science dressed in good institutions is far, far more dangerous than honest quackery.
Because if a guy is selling snake oil out of the back of a wagon, the public knows to employ basic skepticism.
Right, you're on guard. But if a guy is selling the exact same snake oil, and he has a lab coat, a Harvard degree, and a letterhead from a billionaire's foundation, the institutions act as a shield.
They protect the bad science from fundamental scrutiny. The public and even lawmakers just outsource their critical thinking to the prestige of the institution.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for the average, vulnerable person living in the 1920s? We have fraudulent scientific consensus protected by elite institutions completely immune to internal critique. It is locked in.
It is entirely locked in.
But it didn't just stay in the card catalogs at Cold Spring Harbor. Data, even fraudulent data, is meant to be used, and Harry Laughlin was determined to use it as a weapon.
He was. Laughlin was not content to just be a researcher. He was an incredibly aggressive, highly effective political lobbyist.
He took the manipulated findings of the ERO and translated them directly into actionable state and federal legislation.
The Eugenics Record Office basically turned bad data into the law of the land.
Our dossiers trace this horrific pipeline, from a misreading of Mendel to biased measurement to manufactured evidence to state policy. In 1914, Harry Laughlin drafted what he called the Model Eugenical Sterilization Law.
The Model Eugenical Sterilization Law was basically a template. Laughlin wrote a fill-in-the-blank legal framework for state legislatures to just copy and paste.
And what did it authorize?
It authorized the state to surgically sterilize anyone deemed a socially inadequate person.
And remember how vaguely they define that term.
Extremely vaguely. The law targeted the feeble-minded, the insane, criminals, epileptics, inebriates, the diseased, the blind, the deaf, and the deformed.
It was a massive dragnet for the vulnerable. And Laughlin's template was devastatingly successful. Over 30 states eventually adopted laws based directly on his model.
Which led to over 60,000 Americans being surgically sterilized against their will.
60,000.
Yeah.
And we must be explicitly clear about who bore the brunt of this state violence. Because this was not applied equally across society.
Not at all. The state targeted the poor, the disabled, and disproportionately Black and Latino women. They targeted the exact same marginalized populations that the field workers had been interrogating in the poorhouses a decade earlier.
People who lacked the social capital, the financial resources, or the legal standing to fight back against the overwhelming power of the state.
And this wasn't just rogue local judges acting out of line. This pipeline of bad science went all the way to the highest court in the United States.
Yes, it did. In 1927, the Supreme Court heard the landmark case of Buck v. Bell.
Buck v. Bell. This is honestly one of the darkest, most shameful moments in American jurisprudence.
The state of Virginia wanted to test the constitutionality of their newly minted sterilization law, which was based on Laughlin's model.
Right. And the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, a man named Albert Priddy, needed a test case.
So they chose a young woman named Carrie Buck, who was an inmate at the colony. And the cruelty of Carrie Buck's specific story is just staggering when you look at the historical record.
It really is. Carrie Buck wasn't even feeble-minded by any objective medical standard. She was entirely a victim of circumstance and class.
She had been living with a foster family. She was raped by a relative of that foster family, and she became pregnant out of wedlock.
And to hide the social scandal of the pregnancy, the family basically conspired to have her committed to the state colony.
The entire legal process was effectively staged. The lawyer assigned to defend Carrie Buck, a man named John Whitehead, was a former board member of the very colony trying to sterilize her.
Talk about a conflict of interest.
He was actively colluding with the state's attorney, Aubrey Strode, to ensure that Carrie lost the case. They wanted the law to be permanently upheld by the courts.
And where does Harry Laughlin fit into this trial?
Well, Laughlin, sitting hundreds of miles away at the ERO on Long Island, provided a written, sworn expert deposition for the trial.
He testified that Carrie Buck, her mother, who was also in the colony, and Carrie's infant daughter, all belonged to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South.
Wait, had Laughlin ever met Carrie Buck? Did he interview her or her baby?
Never. He had never laid eyes on her.
So he diagnosed her, her mother, and an infant baby as genetically defective simply by looking at a pedigree chart mailed to him by the colony.
Based on the exact same junk methodology Henry Goddard used with the Kallikaks.
And the Supreme Court of the United States bought it wholesale. The cardboard skyscraper held up in the highest court.
It did. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. wrote the majority opinion. It was an 8-1 decision upholding the state's right to sterilize Carrie Buck.
And Holmes wrote one of the most chilling lines in legal history. He wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough."
3 generations of imbeciles are enough. With those words, relying entirely on fraudulent pedigrees and biased depositions, the Supreme Court validated the eugenic worldview.
The state was granted the constitutional authority to literally sever the bloodlines of its poorest and most vulnerable citizens.
But Laughlin didn't stop at domestic sterilization.
No, he didn't. Because if the goal of eugenics was about, quote, purifying the national bloodline, you don't just stop the people inside the country from having children.
You stop people from coming into the country. Laughlin turned his attention to immigration. He acted as an expert eugenics agent to the United States Congress.
He directly shaped the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act.
Laughlin went to Capitol Hill, armed with the ERO's massive binders of statistics. the exact same statistical shell game that Herbert Spencer Jennings had explicitly debunked.
And he testified before the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. He argued that America was being biologically poisoned by the inferior blood of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe.
And Congress listened. The Johnson-Reed Act established national origins quotas.
But here's the incredibly insidious part about how they designed those quotas. They didn't base the quotas on the most recent census of 1920.
No, they deliberately rolled the clock back. They based the quotas on the census of 1890, before the massive waves of Italian and Jewish immigrants had arrived.
It was mathematically engineered to severely restrict the immigration of those specific groups, alongside completely banning Asian immigration.
He also heavily influenced state marriage laws. You see the fingerprints of the ERO on the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which enforced strict racial segregation in marriage based on a draconian one-drop rule of non-white ancestry.
Managed by a massive state bureaucracy led by a man named Walter Plecker, who frequently corresponded with Laughlin.
The sheer velocity of this social engineering is breathtaking.
In the span of about 15 years, a flawed reading of Gregor Mendel's pea plants had been transformed by elite funding into a vast legal apparatus that decided who could have children, who could enter the country, and who could marry.
It was a runaway train. And the darkest downstream effect of this American engine, it didn't stay in America.
No, it did not. American eugenics became the direct blueprint for Nazi Germany.
This is not hyperbole. It is a matter of documented historical record. The Rockefeller Foundation had heavily funded German eugenics and psychiatric research throughout the 1920s.
And when the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, one of their early legislative acts was the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. It was heavily, explicitly modeled on Harry Laughlin's template.
The Nazis looked at what America was doing, looked at the Carnegie-funded research, and said, this is the model.
In fact, the University of Heidelberg awarded Harry Laughlin an honorary doctorate in 1936 for his contributions to the science of racial cleansing.
And later, after the horrors of the Holocaust were exposed to the world, when the Nazi doctors and administrators were put on trial at Nuremberg, they actually cited the United States in their own legal defense.
They pointed directly to Buck v. Bell and Harry Laughlin's model law and argued, we were just following the science that you Americans pioneered. We just took it to its logical conclusion.
It is the ultimate tragedy of the respectable network. The elites of the Gilded Age built a pseudo-scientific machine to justify their own economic privilege, and they handed the blueprints of that machine directly to a fascist regime that used it to justify genocide.
So how does a nightmare like this end? Does the train just keep rolling? Well, eventually, the actual science caught up with the institutional myth.
There is a reckoning. It is a partial redemption in this story, though we must be very careful not to overstate it.
Science as a method does have an autocorrect mechanism, right?
It does. It is painfully slow, and it can be suppressed by institutional power for decades. But eventually, empirical reality demands to be seen.
By the 1930s, the actual field of genetics was maturing. Real scientists were moving far past Mendel's simple binary ratios.
They were beginning to understand population genetics, genetic mutation, and the massive, undeniable role of the environment in human development.
And as real genetics matured, the prude, simplistic, deeply prejudiced Mendelism of Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin became scientifically indefensible.
The cardboard in the basement was starting to rot, and everybody could finally smell it.
And the very institution that had lent the ERO its prestige finally had to confront the rot. In 1935, the Carnegie Institution of Washington convened a formal review committee to look at the work being done at Cold Spring Harbor.
Finally, somebody brings a flashlight into the basement to check the structural integrity of the skyscraper.
And what do they find?
They found exactly what Herbert Spencer Jennings had been shouting about a decade earlier. The committee painstakingly reviewed the massive card catalogs, the pedigree charts, and the coercive methods of the field workers.
And their conclusion was utterly devastating.
They found that the Eugenics Record Office's work was scientifically worthless.
The data was so contaminated by class bias, subjective judgment, and poor methodology that it could not be used for any legitimate biological or genetic research.
They basically said, this isn't a science lab. It's a massive warehouse of prejudice.
But despite that damning report, it still took them a few more years to fully pull the plug.
It did. It wasn't until 1939 that a new president took over the Carnegie Institution. His name was Vannevar Bush.
Vannevar Bush is a highly consequential figure here. He was not a biologist. He was an engineer.
And as an engineer, he had absolutely no patience for systems that simply did not work. He looked at the ERO, saw that it was producing faulty, ideologically driven output, and he decisively shut the entire operation down.
He forced Harry Laughlin into retirement, pulled the funding, and closed the doors of the Eugenics Record Office forever.
So the ERO closes in 1939. The American engine is officially shut down.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, how do we evaluate this reckoning?
We have to analyze this through the lens of institutional history. Yes, the scientific method eventually corrected itself. The Carnegie Review Committee ultimately did the right thing.
But we cannot let the institutions off the hook for the delay.
Exactly. This proves that while science is vulnerable to honest scrutiny, decades of irreversible damage can be done before that scrutiny finally breaks through the armor of institutional prestige.
Decades of damage. Millions of people were denied entry to the country, fleeing persecution because of Laughlin's quotas. 60,000 vulnerable Americans were permanently surgically sterilized.
The Supreme Court established a precedent for bodily violation that has never technically been fully overturned.
The very institution Carnegie that lent eugenics its overwhelming authority was the one that ultimately had to withdraw it. But the withdrawal of funding does not erase the scars on the population.
The idea had already escaped the lab and embedded itself in the law.
And that's the lingering, haunting aftermath. The ERO closed in 1939. But the state sterilization laws that Harry Laughlin wrote, they stayed on the books.
People were still being sterilized under those laws in several states well into the 1970s. Long after the science was thoroughly debunked, the legal machinery kept churning.
Which brings us back to where we started. We've been on quite a journey today.
We really have.
We started with an idea, a farmhouse on Long Island, and an army of field workers armed with clipboards and prejudice.
We saw how a deeply flawed reading of genetics was weaponized by an elite network university presidents at Harvard and Stanford, robber baron philanthropy from Harriman and Carnegie.
We saw how they used the immense prestige of those institutions to wash the data, turning retouched photos, rural gossip, and junk statistics into federal immigration laws and Supreme Court mandates.
We saw the mechanics of how a cardboard skyscraper gets built, validated, and sold to the public as a fortress of truth.
And we saw how the experts failed us, how the desire to conform to a comfortable elite consensus and the fear of challenging institutional power silenced the internal critics until the damage was already done.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
History shows us that we rarely recognize consensus junk science while we are living inside it. The people handing out medals at the state fairs, the justices sitting on the Supreme Court, the presidents of the Ivy League, they genuinely thought they were following the absolute best, most rigorous science of their day.
They could not see the cardboard foundation because they were blinded by the luxury of the lobby.
So the question you must carry forward into your own historical analysis is this. If the most celebrated universities and the wealthiest philanthropies of the 1920s could be so thoroughly captured by their own biases, what highly funded, institutionally protected, settled science of our current era might future historians look back on with the exact same horror?
It's a terrifying question because right now, somewhere, somebody is moving into a very tall, very expensive building and they haven't checked the basement.